In December 2011, Farming Smarter held its annual conference and trade show at the Lethbridge Lodge Hotel, bringing together over 250 agricultural professionals and over 20 speakers. The conference served to educate members of the farming community on growing trends, opportunities, and issues facing today's agricultural industry. We now take you to the Farming Smarter conference to view the presentation of our speakers.
All right, I think I've got by far the hardest job here today. I got to keep you interested for 15 minutes before we break. So I'm going to do my best. I had a lot of good help today, and that comes in the form of all the other speakers we had here today. So you can ignore the comic. I just wanted to transition. But the thing I want to talk to you today is about our carbon footprint. And so all the other speakers kind of alluded to these ideas of where agriculture is going. So Jolene Brown talked about having an experience. Sherry talked about how you're going to brand your farm. Mr. Hirsch was talking about all the opportunities for marketing lentils and peas in Alberta. And so why do you care about your carbon footprint? Well, there's two really big reasons why you care about your carbon footprint. The first is a branding potential. If you're marketing your farm as something that's very environmentally sustainable, you're going to have a very big edge over anybody else who's just in it for the dough. The other thing is, if you are using agronomic practices that are environmentally sustainable and are very good for conservation, they happen to fall right in line with, I guess, if you're doing things that, how's the best way to say this? If you're doing practices that are environmentally sustainable, say for example, trying to reduce your nitrogen inputs and your fuel usage, when those inputs become more costly, you're going to already be ahead of the curve. So I kind of like to think of carbon footprint as the no-till 2.0 for the web junkies out there. So what did we do in our research project? One of the first things we noticed is that seeding depth as it relates to horsepower was a critical factor in conserving energy at seeding. So this is versus cultivation. Cultivation had an effect, but not nearly as much as seeding depth. The second part of this study was kind of describing what are all your carbon inputs, and how do they relate to your overall energy footprint. So your carbon footprint is made up of all the fossil inputs you use for production: seeding, fuel, herbicide. The SSC is seeding, swathing, and combining, or spraying, swathing, and combining. Machinery's there, and it looks like I left one out, but that's on the next slide here, and that one's the biggest one of all, and that's your nitrogen input. So all the time we spend harping on farmers about good agronomic practices, well, it's because it pays dividends where it counts. So the other part of nitrogen input is that all the good agronomic practices you have are going to be very critical for conserving energy. So pulses of your crops, peas and lentils, have the lowest energy for production, and that's because of the nitrogen-fixing bacteria called rhizobium, and they live in the root nodules. So, like I said before, pulses have a very good potential for environmental marketing. So this is a picture of Ian, our summer student, and he's saying he grows pulses, and at his farm they keep their carbon footprint low. So he's branding his farm as something that's environmentally sustainable, and he's prepared for all the changes that might come to the markets. So now I'm going to go all the way back to thermodynamics, which is kind of my background. I took biochemistry in school, so this is kind of the physics side of things, and most of you haven't probably thought about this, but what's the first law of thermodynamics? Well, it's not that we don't talk about thermodynamics. It's the law of conservation of energy. And so what this law says is that energy is neither created or destroyed, but only changed from one form to another. So if you think about what you're doing in agricultural production, you're actually taking the seed or a piece of grain, which is the energy in the form that we want it to be, and you're taking and you're seeding it, and then you're using energy to seed it, and you're using fuel to drive that tractor, and then you're expecting energy from the sun to come down and the water and photosynthesis to take place to change the energy profile, and then it turns into kind of more of a grass. And of course we don't eat grass, but as it grows, it matures and it hardens, and we don't eat the straw or the chaff. And then as it's a finished product, it turns into a seed, and there's a whole system of energy, and it's gone from something unusable to something usable. And so if you think of something like biofuels, it's kind of interesting. It's just as a side note. That's really what we're doing. We're taking products and converting them into other forms of more usable energy. So I'm going to talk about our trial really quick. We had 4 different crops. We seeded peas and barley. We seeded camelina, and we seeded canola. And so this was a demonstration that we did at an open house that we had. And so I'm standing there, and I asked a lot of farmers, but I think a lot of people were just there who worked at the station. They worked in the kitchen, all sorts of places, and really wanted to know what's going on. So they didn't really have all the answers here for what was happening. What this demonstration did was we set up a bunch of different products. So I've got a gas tank to represent the fuel usage, and a thing of herbicide there, and a bucket to represent the nitrogen input. And I asked them, and I said, okay, so what proportion of your energy input comes from each one of these elements? So if you look at canola and barley and camelina, the fuel usage is about 3 to 8%, depending on the crop. Herbicide was 1 to 5%. Machinery is 6 to 10%. The seeding, swathing, combining is 7 to 9%. And then you get your nitrogen fertilizer, which is like 75% of the total energy input. So they thought that was kind of interesting. And I guess the other part of that is when you go to something like peas, all the numbers change and go crazy, because all of a sudden you're only using 8% input coming from peas. So the trial itself was really neat. It was a very, very long day. We started about 7 in the morning and ended about 7, 8 o'clock at night. And it was a really good chance to seed 4 different crops. We seeded much bigger plots than we normally would. These were about 50 meters long, just because we wanted to get good fuel measurements. We seeded all the crops in the same day, the same spot, the same dark brown soil zone. So we had the same weather conditions the whole growing season. So it was a really good opportunity to kind of compare all the different systems in a really scientific way. So the first thing we did was take fuel measurements. Before and after, we weighed this gas tank, and then Ken switched it on for each one of the passes. And we got about 7, 8, 9, 10 grams difference in between each one. And we were actually able to quantify that and figure out what our fuel used at seeding was. And so for each one of the crops, you'll see there's not a whole lot of difference between the kind of the blue fuel usage. It kind of looks like it goes up from canola, barley, peas as you go deeper. The camelina was a little bit of an oddball. And then for all the tilled treatments, they're obviously about double. That's because we included the fuel used for cultivation. So it told us a story, but not as much of a story as we were hoping. So that's where this load cell comes in. The load cell is hooked up between the tractor and the seeder, and it's hooked up to a laptop with a couple little buttons on the tractor so that we could get the draft measurements as we do a pass to see how hard is it pulling, how much force is it using. So this is what we use to calculate the horsepower. So P for the horsepower on the left just equals the pounds of force that we got from the load cell times our velocity, and then there's a constant there for converting units and stuff like that. And then we got a really cool chart. So if we look at way down at the bottom at camelina, we used about 6 horsepower to seed that trial. You can go up to about 9 for the canola, 12 for the barley, and 15 for the peas. And so all the letters there represent significance. So each one of those data points are statistically significant. Well, they're statistically different from the other data points. And I don't know, I think that's kind of interesting. And it's a good news story for no-till, because if you're conserving moisture, you're able to seed shallower. And if you're seeding shallower, obviously you're going to be using a lot less horsepower. The other interesting part on there is the tilled. And if you look at the tilled, they were slightly lower. They're about 15 to 20% lower actually in horsepower for the same crop. And I guess if you think of it this way, if you're driving a truck on the sand, it's a little harder to drive on the sand, but it's also easier to dig in. So that might be part of the reason why it's not as great as maybe some people expected the difference to be, but there still was a small difference. So the fuel usage is only kind of the first part of the story here. So if we're looking at the fossil inputs for all of the crop production, we have to look at the seeding, at the fuel, the spraying, swathing, combining, the herbicide, nitrogen and phosphorus, and the machinery. So this is just the numbers that I mentioned before represented in a pie chart, and these are the what did I say, 3 to 8% for fuel, 1 to 5 for herbicides, 6 to 10 for machinery, and it looks like it's about 75% for the nitrogen. So no-till canola, no-till barley, no-till camelina all look about the same, right? So if you're a farmer and you've got a camelina and barley rotation, which is probably not very likely here, you're going to end up, well, not with barlina, but your energy profile is going to look the same. So all 3 of those pies look exactly the same, right? So if you're growing canola and wheat, which you guys probably grow a lot of here, your energy profile is going to look exactly the same. So where does the difference come in? It comes in at these peas. And like I said, as soon as you have a really low amount, low percentage of your energy inputs coming in the form of your inorganic fertilizers, you're going to totally skew the other numbers out of proportion here. And so the amount of seeding you use at fuel for peas is exactly the same as it is for the other crops. The amount of herbicide and machinery maintenance and all that, it's all going to be the same. It's just when you look at it in terms of what proportion is that coming to, it all looks a lot different. So if you're looking for a way to brand this and you want to say that you're very environmentally conscious, you might have your canola profile there and your pea profile here, which is a lot smaller. And then you get quite a bit of difference. You don't quite have that 75% anymore, and you have a lot smaller energy inputs overall. So far I've only mentioned inputs, but the point of this project was to look at the carbon footprint. And when we do that, we have to look at all the energy for production. So we don't just want to look at input, we want to look at output, because even if you have really low inputs, if you're not getting an output, there's not really much point to doing it. So this was a chart we made for our open house, and these were estimated yields. So I think there's about 50 bushels for the camelina and canola, I think 60, 65 for barley, and maybe about 40 for peas. And so what we did was we took an actual number that we figured. So we took the fuel use, the herbicide, we took all those numbers and we quantified them into an energy number, just like you would calories on a chocolate bar. And we said, okay, this is how much energy it takes to produce each one of these crops. And so what this chart is showing is it's showing that amount of energy, but then it's dividing by the yield. So per kilogram of crop here, this is what our energy was supposedly, our energy for production might look like. Now the cool part about this project was that we actually got all this data. So we harvested these crops and we were able to punch it in here, and that's what it actually looked like. So there's a couple cool things on there. The first one is it was all lower. So the reason for that was we probably had a much better yield. So camelina, for instance, especially in no-till, we seen we had a quite a good yield there. And same with the barley. So we had a really good yield in barley, so it ended up actually lowering our total energy for production because we got a really good output from it. But as you can see, the lowest one there still is the peas. So what makes the peas so good? Well, that's the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They live in the root nodules here. And I'm going to kind of shift gears. The one on the left is a spring-seeded pea plot. And there's hardly any root nodules on it. But the one on the right is a project we've been working on for a couple years. And that's the winter peas. And so they have very, very good nodulation. And it kind of goes to show the potential that these winter peas might have for trap cropping. So this is what the plots look like. They were awesome. We had really good fall moisture in 2010 when these were seeded, and we had a pretty good spring for them to grow in. We had other years in the past where fall moisture was pretty bad, and that seems to be probably the most important factor in how well these establish. This was a lentil plot we tried to do, I think, back in fall of 2008 or 2009. It was really dry, and we had problems with low plant stands in the fall, and then obvious weed pressure later on. So that's what they currently look like now for what we've seeded this year. They're pretty small. We were hoping to get a little better moisture, but we just didn't get it this year. So we're going to apply, I think, for some funding, and hopefully we get some more good data from these. I just got 3 more slides to share with you. These are some of the results we got from these winter pea and winter lentil trials. So the first one comes from our agronomy trial, and what we did was we started off with a whole bunch of dates, depths, fertilities, seeding rates, I think, and there's about 30, 35 different things, different plots they were looking at, and we managed to kind of sum it up to these last 6 in the last year. So our winter peas did really good. They're the Wyndham winter peas in the blue here. We seeded them September 15th and September 29th. We got about just under 2,000 kgs a hectare. And compared, unfortunately, to the winter peas in the springtime, the winter peas in the spring didn't do so well at all. We had a really good crop with these centennials seeded early spring, but that was April 28th. And we have a really good piece of research land. It drains really well. And we got our stuff seeded before pretty much everybody else. A lot of guys didn't seed till May, June this year. So if you look down here at the really low yields, chances are other guys' crops may have been a little lower like that. The other trial was our winter lentil agronomy, and we actually found no statistical difference between any of the crops. So we've had really good success with our winter lentils. The years past, not so much, but this year, this past year especially, was especially good. And then finally, we've got winter pea and spring pea yields from our pea leaf weevil trial, and that's where the root nodule picture came from. Some of the centennials seem to do a little better in this trial. The letters indicate significance, so the A all seem to do better than some of these winter trials. We had actually really good success with the Apromax and Matador treatment, as well as the Cruiser Max insecticide treatment. One thing I guess to note, which was interesting, is that even the lowest yield here was about 1,800, and some of our other spring peas were really high, and I think that might just be because of the plot design we had and the way everything canopied over and the spacing between. We had this pea leaf weevil right beside the agronomy trials and just got much better yields on this trial. So with that, thank you for listening. It's my first time speaking, so I appreciate everybody's patience. And hope you're all ready to have some fun tonight.